Hello and welcome to Torah Thoughts. The Torah portion that we read this week's Parsha, is Parshat Va'era, which means, and I showed myself. This is God having a conversation with Moshe, and he tells him about how he showed himself to Avram, to the patriarchs, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and promised them what was about to happen, that he was going to take the Jews out from slavery, the nation of Israel, out from slavery in Egypt. And now he's describing to Moshe how he made this promise to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and here he is about to fulfill that promise. So, in this particular parsha, we see the beginning of the story of the Exodus, which, of course, is about Paro refusing to release the Jews, and that, of course, leads to the plagues and the splitting when he chases the Jews as they leave Egypt, the splitting of the sea, and so on. So the first 7 of the 10 plagues are found in this particular parsha. The last 3 are in next week's parsha, Bo. So I want to discuss some recurring phrases that we see within this parsha. There are 2 actually phrases, 2 themes that keep repeating. One is the very famous phrase, "Let my people go," Shalach et ami. This is where Moshe, under God's instructions, tells Paro, God says, "You're enslaving the Jewish people, you're enslaving the nation of Israel, let my people go." And that's what became famous from the movie. And this keeps being repeated every time Moshe comes to Paro. Ko amar Hashem, so says God, let my people go. And so that they may serve me. That's that little addendum that people forget. It wasn't simply let my people go, it was Shalach et ami ve'yavduni. Let my people go, not so that we can say we're free. We could have been free in Egypt. What's the point of leaving? We had to leave Egypt so that we can serve God, so that we can live under God's rules and not under Egyptian rules. But anyway, the recurring theme, let my people go, and the other recurring theme is the hardening of Paro's heart. We see repeatedly, God tells Moshe, I will harden Paro's heart, so that way I can bring, in essence, so that I can bring those plagues on Egypt, and I can show the whole world my miracles. Or it says, and God hardened Paro's heart, or some variation of that. 10 times in this particular parsha, in Parshat Va'era, we see a reference to Paro's heart being hardened, or to God saying that he is going to harden Paro's heart. And it's clear, and God says he will do this so that I can increase my marvels that I will bring upon the land of Egypt. So, this obviously poses a question. Is this fair? I mean, God is telling Moshe, I will make Paro's heart hard, so that way he won't obey me, and that way I can punish him. That doesn't sound just. That doesn't sound fair. We believe in a just and fair God, right? So, where's this concept? How do we reconcile this? That God is purposely going to cause Paro to not listen to him, and then he's going to turn around and punish him. That on the face of it doesn't seem to make sense. So let's look at this from a bit of from a broader view. The Exodus from Egypt, the story of the Exodus, it's actually the second of 4 colossal, world-shaking events in human history. Actually, 3 of them already happened. The 4th one hasn't happened yet. So those are, the first one was the creation of the world itself and the creation of mankind. And well, obviously that's colossal and world shaking, I say, rather world creating. The second one was the Exodus. The third one was God's revelation at Mount Sinai and conveying the 10 Commandments and the Torah to the nation of Israel. And the 4th, like I said, which hasn't happened yet, is the coming of the Mashiach and the perfection of the world to the form that it was intended. So all of history that we see happening now is for the purpose of when Mashiach comes. It's basically for the world leading to being in a state of perfection, which will ultimately happen when Mashiach comes. So the first, the creation of the world and of mankind, it's obvious why that was world shaking, why that was so colossal, why that was so vital. And I'll explain each one as we go through, but we see a common thread in all. Let's deal with the 3 events that already happened first. There's a common thread in all 3 of them, which is, number 1, we see God's dominion in the world. In each of these events, we see how God is the master of everything that is, and he controls everything. He's the boss. And the second one is free will. that we find within the relationship between God and humanity. And it's for those reasons, these two common threads, that's actually the reason why these three, and then finally the fourth event will be, but why these three events are so important, why they're so central to the history of the world. And so in the creation is obvious, God's dominion over the world. We see that in creation because, well, he literally created the world by saying it. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, let there be water, and there was water. That's his control, his dominion over everything. We see that literally he creates the universe with his will. And then, of course, we see free will with the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were given the choice of whether or not to eat from the tree of knowledge. And the tree of knowledge, what is it? It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So before Adam and Eve ate from that tree of knowledge, I don't know whether it was an actual physical tree or whether it was metaphorical. I tend to believe that if it's written in the Torah, it's literal. But I'll leave that to people who are much greater experts than I am. But in any event, though, by eating from that tree, literally or metaphorically, by eating from that tree, they acquired the concept of doing something because it is good versus doing something because it is bad. The concept of morality, the knowledge of good and evil, they acquired from eating of that tree. And even whether or not they're going to eat from that tree, it had to be their choice, which is a whole discussion in and of itself. But the concept of free will and free choice comes from the story of Adam and Eve eating from that tree. And then you have I'll come back to the Exodus. I'm going to skip first to the story, to the revelation at Sinai. Again, we see God's dominion over the world in the giving of the Torah, because the Torah itself is what? It's God's laws, right? And the fact that God gives you a law, and he says you have to follow this law. Now, there's two kinds of laws. Some laws, we see the logic in them, and some laws, which are called chok or chukim, those are laws that we don't necessarily understand the logic behind it, but we follow it simply because God says so. He's the master of the world. He's the boss. And that's where we see the dominion. God made the universe. He created us. He gives us the rules. He decides. He decides everything. And that's what the Torah is about. And we also see from the revelation of Sinai, we see the concept of free will, because the nation of Israel had to willingly and freely accept the Torah. God didn't impose it on them. He asked them whether they want to accept it, and they accepted the Torah of their own free will and committed to obeying its laws in the future. And now let's take a look at the Exodus. God control, but when God brings those 10 plagues on Egypt, and then ultimately when he splits the sea, what we see, what's being demonstrated here is that God controls the very laws of nature, and he has the power to change them. Water doesn't generally turn to blood. That's not the way. That's not the way God created nature. But in this particular case, God says, "Look, I created nature. I will defy nature." And God commands the water to turn to blood. God commands all of these plagues to occur, even though all of them contradict nature. And then, of course, we see free will, which is what we started with in this particular Torah thought. So, do we really see free will here? Let my people go, right? God tells Moshe to tell Paro, let my people... What do you mean, let my people go? God hardened Paro's heart so that he shouldn't let my people go. Where's the free will in that? So, the other thing is, the question of let my people go, did God really need Paro's consent? God could have taken the Jews out of Egypt on his own. He didn't need Paro to agree to this. He didn't need Paro to let my people go. He could have taken them out himself. But what we see here is that God wants Paro to make the decision to release the nation of Israel of his own free will. God didn't pluck the Jews out of Egypt and say, okay, you're coming out. He decided that Paro was going to make that decision. Which brings us back to our original problem. Where is the free will if God is hardening Paro's heart? So, well, let's take a look at what is free will, all right? When God gives us laws, right, God doesn't force us to obey his laws. He gives us the right, he gives us the ability to obey his laws. Do you want to put tefillin today or do you not want to put tefillin? It's your choice. Now, of course, there's going to be repercussions, but you decide whether or not you're going to obey God's law. He does coerce you, though, doesn't he, right? Because there is punishment and reward, and that to some extent is a coercion. I'm going to keep Shabbat because, well, I don't want to get punished, right? And it's the same with every one of God's commandments. So we see that free will, it doesn't mean that there's no repercussions. I can do what I want. Free will means you choose your actions and you live with the outcome. And the outcome could be good or bad. It could be punishment or it could be reward, and so on. On the other hand, what if there's if someone's pointing a gun to your head, right, and forces you, and we actually use the phrase, forces you to do what they want. We don't call that free will. So for example, if somebody walks into a bank and robs the bank, and he walks out with a whole bunch of money and then gets caught, he can't come to court and say, well, the teller gave me the money of his own free will. No, you held a gun to his head. Right? So we see that there's somewhat of a paradox here. On the one hand, there needs to be punishment and reward in the world. If there isn't punishment and reward, then there's no justice. If one person lives his life as a really good human being, he obeys God's commandments, he does everything he's supposed to, and then the other person is just an absolute evil person, and both of them die, they come to the next world, it wouldn't be just for the two of them to be treated the same. This one obeyed God, he needs to be rewarded. This one disobeyed God, this one was evil, he needs to be punished. Otherwise there is no justice. So we have to believe, if we believe in a just and fair God, there's punishment and reward. But punishment and reward are not compatible with free will. Why? Because on the one hand, if you're unaware that there's going to be punishment and reward, then it really isn't free will because you're not making an informed decision. Right? I can't say that I disobeyed God when I didn't know for sure what's going to happen if I disobey God. In fact, that's built in to the rules of the Torah. All the punishments that are prescribed by the Torah, they require, besides proof that the person committed the sin, there also has to be proof that the person received a warning and understood the warning, which included the fact that you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z, and that the person knew what the punishment would be. They were aware and they clearly understood the punishment. Otherwise, you can't give them the punishment because if you don't make an informed decision, it's not free will. On the other hand, though, if you were aware of the punishments and rewards that come with the commandments, then it's a coercion. I kept God's word. I obeyed God's commandment because I didn't want to get punished. It's not exactly free will. Like, for example, if the police points, let's go back to that bank robber. If the police points a gun at the bank robber and he surrenders himself, we don't say he surrendered himself of his own free will. He was forced to. So there's your paradox. There has to be punishment and reward for there to be justice, but there also has to be free will. But once you have punishment and reward, where's the free will then? So God has to create a balance. He creates this balance where there is punishment and reward, but he gives us the ability to rationalize it away. Right? For example, if say you have to keep Shabbat, right? And I want to go to synagogue, I want to go to shul this Shabbat, but it's far, it's cold, or it's snowing, it's raining, what have you, and I'm going to go in my car. So I might rationalize that by saying, well, you know something? God wants me to go to shul, doesn't he? And he wants me to go to synagogue, and God wants me to be comfortable, doesn't he? So I'm sure he doesn't mind me driving. And that's what we call the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which Freud termed the id, right? Where you do what you want, what is immediately comfortable to yourself, even though you know, rationally, logically, you know that you shouldn't, but you find a way to rationalize your actions. And this is what God gives us. He gives us the ability to do that. We know that we should do something and we don't do it, or we know that we shouldn't do it, yet we do it. So another example would be lighting, and this is a classic example here. Someone who lights a fire on Shabbat will say, well, you know, the Torah tells us not to light a fire on Saturday. It doesn't mean in modern terms lighting a fire. Back then, lighting a fire required a lot of work. You were supposed to rub two sticks together, and we know that that's not true. Because if you've ever watched one of these reality shows where somebody gets dropped off in the jungle or a wilderness or what have you, and they have to survive over there, and one of the first things that they set out to do is to build a fire. And they don't build a fire every time they want fire. They build it once. And then from there, the fire keeps going. They keep feeding the fire. And every time they need fire, they'll take a twig or whatever, and you light the fire, and then you go do whatever you want to do with that fire. That's exactly what they did back in the days when the Torah was given. People didn't make a new fire by rubbing two sticks. There was an existing fire outside the camp or what have you. And whenever someone needed fire, they took. We know that. It's rational. It's logical. And yet they weren't allowed to make fire the easy way back then. So we know deep down when we say, oh no, that's not what the Torah meant. It's a lie. We lie to ourselves. And God gives us the ability to do that so that way we're not coerced by the crime, by the punishment and reward, but we are aware of it. And we see that again. I'll give one last example. Pork. Well, the reason why we're not allowed to eat pork was because back then it wasn't healthy. Today we know how to make it clean. We can get rid of it. No, that's not true. All right? Pork is not allowed because God said it's not allowed, and you know that, and it says so in the Torah. And you know that if you believe in an omnipotent and all-knowing and perfect God, God knew when He gave the Torah that there would come a day when we can make pork not dangerous, and yet He said, "Don't eat pork ever." So this is the ability that God gave us, the id, the Yetzer Hara, the ability. We know the truth. We know that we shouldn't be doing something or that we have to do something, but we disobey and we kind of give ourselves the ability to rationalize that away. So, and that's how we developed free will, because now you have to choose. Are you going to give in to this inclination, or are you going to do what you know is right? And that's free will. Now, imagine you take this formula, okay? And every time I want to disobey a commandment in the Torah, I'm about to disobey the commandment, and thunder and lightning come striking down from the sky. I'm not going to commit that sin. So let's say it's Saturday, I'm about to light up a cigarette, right? And suddenly, boom, thunder and lightning. I guarantee you, if that happens to anyone, they're not going to light up that cigarette. Well, you just lost the free will, because that's more of a direct coercion, right? So imagine, okay, it's not thunder and lightning, but you disobey God, and all of the water that you have access to turns to blood. Your entire land gets flooded with frogs. Everyone in the country and all the animals in the country end up having lice. And the streets are covered, and the 10 plagues, obviously. That's similar to the gun to your head. That's coercion. There goes the free will. There's no more free will. So God had to harden Paro's heart in order to give him free will. God didn't take away Paro's ability to release the nation of Israel. Paro still had the ability to say, you know what, Moshe, you convinced me. I see it now. I see that God is doing all of this. He wants me to release the Jews. And because it is the right thing to do, I'm going to release them. Paro had that ability to do that. What God did in hardening Paro's heart was He gave him the ability to rationalize away the clear proof that Moshe is speaking on behalf of the God of the universe. When it's so crystal clear, you lose the ability to say no. God gave him the ability to rationalize that away, and in so, He hardened his heart. So now Paro says, oh yeah, the blood. And Paro's experts were saying that. The blood in the river, that was some sort of, I don't know if they were familiar with the concept of bacteria, but they attributed it to a bacteria or a poison, they may have called it. Something tainted the river upstream, and all of that came downstream. It poisoned the water, and of course that killed all the fish. And what do you expect when there's no water anywhere, and the fish are I'm sorry, all the water is blood, and the fish are dying? What are all the frogs in the water going to do? They're going to escape the river, and that's why Egypt was flooded with frogs. And now you have a country that's flooded with frogs. There's no fresh water. People can't bathe. People can't wash. People can't even drink. There's disease everywhere. There's dead fish. That brings lice. And what happens when there's lice everywhere? The animals who are affected with the lice, they go crazy. And the cattle, who are now suffering from disease, from no water, and so the cattle die. And the humans, with all the disease and with all the lice, they develop boils on their skin. So the first 6 plagues, that's exactly, and this is not something I'm making up. All of these rationalizations that I'm saying right now, these are the actual rationalizations that the Egyptians used. There was a bacteria that tainted the river, which caused the frogs to come, and it caused the lice, and the animals went crazy because of it, and the cattle died, and the boils on the skin, and so. But the seventh. And by the way, and all of these plagues, with each progressive plague, it became more and more apparent. Because, for example, with the blood, okay, with the plague of blood, Paro said, well, my magicians can do that too. They can turn a few cups of water into blood, but an entire river? His heart had to be hardened. But then came the frogs. When Moshe came to Paro and said, Paro said, okay, fine, make the frogs go away. Just please, I'll let the Jews go. Make the frogs go away. And Moshe said, tell me exactly when you want that to happen. And Paro said, okay, tomorrow morning. And Moshe said, okay, tomorrow morning they'll be gone. Why? To prove this wasn't just some magic trick. At the precise time that Paro requested, that's when the frogs were gone. God needed to harden. It required further hardening. And then came the lice. Now, Paro's magicians tried to copy all of the stuff that Moshe did. But lice, something that tiny, they couldn't do. Again, and in fact, they said to Paro, this is the finger of God. So it required further hardening, and so on. But then came the hail, the seventh plague of Barad. And what happened there was you have a hail that was a mixture of ice and fire. That defies nature itself. Ice and fire mixing, in our mind, it's not possible. Of course it's not possible, but only God can do the impossible. And so then they said, okay, it must be God. And Paro began to negotiate. He still didn't want to release the Jews, but he began to negotiate. And so on, until the final plague of Makat Bechorot, the death of the firstborn. Paro said, okay, let the Jews go. But at this point, it was a coercion. I mean, the kids were dying. And then God hardened his heart again, so that he chased the nation of Israel into the Red Sea, and God split the sea and so forth. And only then, when all was said and done, did Paro realize it was God. He was right. And Paro came back to Egypt from the Red Sea. He came back to Egypt by himself. His entire army was gone. He took on the name Akhenaten, which is it's a variation of the Hebrew Echad Adon, which means there is only one God. It was too late, but he realized. Now the fourth and final colossal event when Mashiach comes is exactly that. Everything in history that leads up to Mashiach coming is about God testing us. Everyone. God tests everyone, so that when it finally happens, when the world is perfected, when all of history leads to that, there's going to be a final accounting. Everyone in the world will get punished and rewarded in accordance to when they decided to choose their faith in God, to go with the evidence rather than rationalizing and letting their id take over. And it depends. Did you believe in God, and did you obey God when it was somewhat evident, when it was completely evident, or somewhere in between? And when it becomes completely evident, when there is no escaping the fact that God is the boss of the universe, God controls it all, and He wants us to have a relationship with Him so that He can love us. That's why He gave us these commandments that we should obey. When that becomes inescapable, there will still be those few who decide to go to war with God. And that's pure evil. And they will be destroyed. And all that will be left in the day that everyone will know that God controls it. By Yom HaHu Hashem Echad Shmo Echad. And then the world will be perfected. There will be nothing left in the world but good. And that's when Mashiach comes. Guess what, folks? That's my Torah thought. Thanks for watching. Shabbat Shalom.